Destiny has seen a sharp rise in the third major food group of special weapons, i.e. fusion rifles, and the community is surprisingly reasonable about their opinions, but I think fusions would be benefited from a bit of a rework. Welcome to Void 3.0, where every hunter's invisible, every titan has an overshield, every warlock has something draining you, and fusions seem to be the #1 primary weapon for a lot of different players. At least that seems to be some of the prevailing opinions. I was pleasantly surprised with how people ended up responding to some of the criticism and feedback I asked for fusion rifles, and I also think that there could be a bit of a rework to fusion rifles in general that would help quell some of the overall issues that we're experiencing with fusion rifles, specifically God roll fusion rifles. One thing to be sure here is that in PvE, no, they're definitely not an issue. PvE will always trade off what is the best depending on what the artifact mods tend to lean towards, because they tend to be the most powerful. So as it stands right now, no, fusions aren't an issue. I think that there's much more interesting things that they could be talked about there. But specifically in PvP, there is a growing conversation about fusion rifles. There's obviously going to be strife on either side whenever weapon balance comes into the conversation. Players tend to get a little bit heated. It's almost as heated as people talking about microtransactions, but divisive opinions begin to form. The typical response I was expecting from everybody is not something that I necessarily didn't get, but it's the general stuff of everyone wants their thing to be good, but nobody wants the other thing to be, balanced with their stuff, and nobody is terribly good at explaining why they think their thing should be better than other things, right? But the actual response that I ended up getting from the community when I put out a poll asking people what their opinions were of fusion rifles was incredibly well responded to and level-headed. 1v1ing a fusion is literally a DPS check in PvP. That seems like a pretty reasonable way to describe a fusion rifle. Certain fusion rifles with specific combinations of perks can be overtuned, but a blanket statement of fusion rifles being OP is too harsh. I think some fusion rifles with certain roles are way more potent weapons than what they should be, but for the most part, they are pretty balanced. Again, this doesn't mean that there weren't people spinning venom on either side, but I'm in love with how well measured each response tended to be. In general, the community tends to agree that it's not necessarily fusion rifles in general that are the problem, it's Xur. Now, hold on here for me with this second, but does anybody know if Bungie controls what Xur sells, or is he kind of just random? Does he kind of just do his own thing, right? Because obviously Bungie's control of kind of generally what he sells, but specifically, are they able to control the exact roles? I don't know. Maybe somebody could ask them, but here's my thought. I think Bungie is still experimenting with fusion rifles, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a change coming to them soon, because Xur has now twice, within the span of like a month or two, sold an absolutely godly fusion rifle, the best archetype with some of the best perks for PvP. It makes you scratch your head a little bit. Maybe that's just me being a bit paranoid, but it does make you wonder if Bungie's doing a little bit of research into the weapon in general so that they can get more data by giving it to more players. Let's look at some of the numbers here. As it stands right now in terms of weapon popularity, the main ingredient, which was one of the weapons that Xur sold, is currently topping the charts for the most popular weapon in PvP by a whole 1.25%, which is a pretty big percentage. Again, this is to be expected because Xur sold an amazing weapon, so people are gonna play with it a little bit more. It's even beating things like IS Luna and Palindrome, which are some of the top dogs and have been some of the top dogs for a while, or even the new Funnel Web or Ace of Spades, which has always been a staple in the meta. What about people's opinions of them? What ended up being the poll? Well, somebody pointed out in the comments I definitely should have specified whether it's PvE or PvP, so you can take a look at this and kind of skew it as you might think it might change if I designated PvP, but asking people, they said generally no, by a pretty large majority, and I'm willing to bet that even if we were to take out the PvE players, it seems like, at least looking at the comments, that people are generally in agreement that at least probably not, they're not too strong. And just as a quick aside, in terms of weapons that are trending, Galahorn obviously is on top, main ingredient followed closely behind, with Ace of Spades following that in general for some of the most used weapons that have been used over the last bit of time. What are my personal opinions on it? Well, I think that fusion rifles are maybe a little strong in 6s, but not in 3s. I don't think in 3s hardly at all. I mean, they're gonna have a place, of course, but I don't think they're the best. I think that generally the higher tier players are gonna typically more focus on shotgun shotguns and sniper rifles, as those are a little bit more consistent, and that is the primary thing I think fusions need to fix. The number one issue with fusions is their diversity in power. You've got a good fusion versus a bad fusion. The gap between those two is way bigger than a bad shotgun versus a good shotgun. Realistically, I can take a green shotgun into PvP and have a pretty good time. If I were to take a bad fusion rifle, like a green or blue fusion rifle with bad perks into PvP, I would really notice it, because that main ingredient is the best, and it feels so good because what you can't control is being reined in. What you aren't able to maintain of the weapon, primarily its spread and how long you're actually able to maintain accuracy, is handled by the perks, not necessarily by the user. Yes, you can control the recoil, but it's a lot harder to control the recoil of the burst of a fusion rifle than it is to say something like an SMG, which is also pretty fast and can be kind of kicky. I want to take the absolute peak of fusion rifle power and the trough of fusion rifle power and bring them closer together, mildly nerfing some of the best fusion rifles while also bringing up some of the worst fusion rifles. And the way that I would do that is I would change fusion rifles to be a singular high damage beam, or like a bolt that would fire out. This would be similar to something like, obviously, like a linear fusion rifle, but the difference is this would have obviously a strict damage drop off, where a linear fusion effectively has infinite range, and it obviously couldn't hit headshots. In terms of the engagement distances, they would be nearly identical. The only difference would be it would be less of a focus on getting perks that constrain the bolts down to being much more consistent, but would rather put you more in a position to get perks that help encourage you as a player to have more control over your own aim, as well as your availability of the gun, things like quick draw and such like that. In order to make sure that stability still has some type of place within the fusion rifle stat list, I would make it so that as you began to hold down the trigger, you would start to experience kick up until the bolt actually fired. This would allow you as a fusion rifle player, maybe you're a great fusion rifle player, to have some way of minimizing a low stability rolled fusion rifle and maybe put effort into other areas of the gun, again, like range or handling or something along those lines. This would allow the bad fusion rifles with a good player to still be able to perform nearly as well as a good fusion rifle with a bad player, which I would argue right now perhaps is a bit too leaning towards having a good fusion rifle versus having a good player. I'm sure I'm going to catch some fire for that, but let's just say there's a reason why this main ingredient is so damn good, and a reason why so many players are using it versus something like the high impacts, which have such a high degree of inaccuracy and inconsistency that it's just not worth your time. Let me know what you think of that idea, and also make sure that you're subscribed. Bless your faces, and deuces.